blood and wet asphalt. That was the stench clinging to Dante's expensive Italian wool coat when he walked into the back room of the Albatross Club, and it immediately made Leo want to break something. Instead, Leo kept his hands resting lightly on the scarred mahogany of the card table. He let the silence stretch. Upstairs, the muffled bass of the nightclub throbbed through the floorboards, a relentless heartbeat, vibrating the half-empty glass of rye whiskey at his elbow. Down here, the air was stagnant, heavy with the sharp acidic tang of spilled liquor and unwashed fear. Dante dropped into the chair across from him, entirely too comfortable. He picked a piece of lint off his lapel. He smiled. It was a thin, predatory stretching of lips over overly whitened teeth. "You're losing your grip on the South Ports, Leo." Dante said, his voice a grating tenor that belonged to a much cheaper man. "3 shipments delayed this month. My guys are getting impatient waiting on the offload." Leo didn't blink. He felt the familiar dull ache building behind his left eye, a tension headache born of dealing with loud men who thought volume equaled power. Dante was a parasite. He didn't build. He skimmed. He wore cologne that smelled like synthetic pine and ambition thick enough to choke on. "The shipments are delayed because the union struck," Leo replied, his voice a low, flat rumble. He reached for his glass, the condensation dampening his calloused fingertips. "And they struck because your idiot cousin broke a stevedore's jaw over a dice game. You want the crates moving, leash your dogs." Dante waved a hand dismissively, the heavy gold pinky ring catching the dim yellowish light of the overhead bulb. "Collateral damage. The point is you're supposed to keep the peace. If you can't, maybe I should take over the dock contracts." Leo took a slow sip of the rye. It burned on the way down, rough and necessary. He set the glass back on the wet ring it had left on the wood. "Try it," he said, perfectly mild. "See how much cargo moves when my guys start breaking your guys' kneecaps." The tension in the room snapped taut. A physical wire pulled between them. Arthur Leo's shadow of a bodyguard standing in the corner shifted his weight. The faint creak of Arthur's leather shoulder holster was the loudest sound in the room. Dante's smile faltered just a fraction of an inch, revealing the cowardice buried beneath the swagger. Before Dante could formulate a response that saved his ego without starting a war, the heavy iron door of the back room clicked open. Leo frowned. Nobody was supposed to interrupt this sit-down. A woman stepped in. The harsh overhead light caught the dust motes swirling around her as she pushed the heavy door shut with her shoulder. She was struggling with 3 thick manila ledgers and a cardboard box of receipts. She wore a faded beige trench coat, dripping rainwater onto the dirty linoleum, and her hair, a messy knot of dull brown, was escaping its clip. Chloe, the new forensic accountant Arthur had hired to clean up the shell companies. She froze, realizing exactly what kind of room she had just walked into. The scent of rain and damp cotton washed over the stale cigar smoke, a jarringly clean intrusion into a filthy space. She didn't look terrified exactly. She looked profoundly annoyed, like she had just stepped in a puddle she had been actively trying to avoid. "I apologize," Chloe said, her voice tight, clutching the box closer to her chest. Her knuckles were white. "Arthur told me to bring the Q3 audits directly to you tonight. I didn't realize there was a meeting." Leo felt a spike of irrational irritation. Not at her, but at the situation. She didn't belong down here. She belonged in a sterile office with fluorescent lights and an espresso machine far away from men like Dante. "Put them on the desk, Chloe," Leo said, keeping his tone carefully neutral. "Then go home." She didn't argue. She scurried to the small metal desk in the corner, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. Her wet sneakers squeaked against the linoleum. It was an undignified, horribly normal sound. Dante turned in his chair, his eyes tracking her movement. The annoyance in Leo's chest curdled into something darker, something prickly and hot. He watched Dante's gaze drop to the curve of Chloe's hips under the damp coat, down to her legs, then back up to the erratic rise and fall of her chest as she dumped the ledgers onto the desk. Dante leaned back, a slow, greasy smirk spreading across his face. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, making a soft, wet, clicking noise. "Well now," Dante murmured loud enough to make sure Leo heard it. He didn't take his eyes off Chloe's back as she scrambled to reorganize a dropped file. "Where did you hide that I thought your whole crew was ugly?" Chloe stiffened. The paper she was holding crumpled slightly in her grip. Leo felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't a romantic rush. It was raw, territorial violence. It was the same instinct that made a stray dog bare its teeth over a scrap of bone. He despised Dante. He despised the way Dante looked at things like the whole world was a clearance rack for his amusement. Dante took what he wanted and ruined it. Dante dragged his tongue over his bottom lip. "She's hot. Give me her number, Leo. We can negotiate the doc contracts over drinks." The words bypassed Leo's rational brain entirely. They skipped the strategic prefrontal cortex and went straight to the ugly feral base of his spine. It was an autonomic reflex driven by years of hatred and a sudden blinding urge to deny Dante absolutely anything he wanted. "She's mine," Leo snapped. The words hit the stagnant air like a gunshot. Dante's head snapped back around his eyes wide, the greasy smile instantly vanishing. In the corner, Arthur let out a slow, barely audible exhale. By the desk, Chloe dropped the box of receipts. It hit the floor with a hollow thud, hundreds of white slips of paper exploding across the dirty linoleum like snow. Leo stared at Dante, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The echo of his own voice rang in his ears. "She's mine." It was a possessive, intimate claim in a world where claims meant blood. He didn't look at Chloe. He couldn't. The horrific realization of what he had just done was already pooling in his gut like swallowed lead. He hadn't meant it like that. He had meant she was his employee, his asset, his problem. But the tone, the absolute venomous possessiveness he had injected into those two words left exactly zero room for professional interpretation. Dante cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. He raised his hands in a mock surrender. All right. Relax, man. I didn't know you had a thing for the help. Keep your girl. We'll talk about the docs tomorrow." Dante stood up, pulling his coat tight around him, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. He gave Chloe one last, wary glance, then walked out the heavy iron door, slamming shut behind him. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. Rain lashed against the single high-frosted window of the basement room. The sound was a harsh, rhythmic static, completely failing to cover the agonizing quiet stretching between Leo and Chloe. Leo stared at the closed iron door. He could feel a bead of sweat tracing a cold line down his spine beneath his tailored shirt. He dragged a heavy hand down his face, the rough stubble on his jaw scratching loudly against his palm. He felt entirely, profoundly stupid. Behind him, the rustle of paper started up again. He turned slowly. Chloe was on her hands and knees, frantically gathering the scattered taxi receipts and diner bills. Her wet coat was dragging through the spilled dust and grime of the floor. She wasn't looking at him. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, bordering on a panic attack. "Leave it," Leo said. His voice sounded hoarse. Chloe didn't stop. Her hands were shaking. She grabbed a fistful of receipts and shoved them haphazardly into the cardboard box. "It's fine. I need to organize the petty cash logs for October. They got mixed up with September. "Chloe, stand up!" It was an order, sharper than he intended. She froze. Slowly she rocked back on her heels and looked up at him. Her face was pale, the damp hair clinging to her cheeks. She didn't look swooning or flattered. She looked furious and terrified. The combination made her green eyes look like shattered glass. "Did you just tell Dante Moretti I belong to you?" she asked, her voice a fragile, vibrating wire. Leo walked over to the desk, his expensive shoes crunching softly on a rogue receipt he had stepped on. He stopped a few feet away from her, towering over her crouched form. He hated the dynamic. He hated the smell of his own whiskey breath mixing with her rain-soaked clothes. "I told him to back off," Leo corrected, though the words tasted like ash. "You said, and I quote, 'She's mine.'" Chloe shot back, scrambling to her feet. She clutched the half-empty box to her chest like body armor. "You didn't say, 'She's my accountant.' You didn't say, 'She's a civilian.' You made it sound like I'm your—" She couldn't even finish the sentence, her face flushing a deep, angry red. It was a reflex. Leo growled, defensive anger flaring to cover his embarrassment. "He was looking at you like meat. I shut it down. By slapping your own barcode on me," she demanded, stepping toward him completely, forgetting who she was talking to. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Dante Moretti is a psychopath. I've read the ledgers, Mr. Russo. I see the disposal fees. I know who these people are. And you just told a rival boss that I am your personal vulnerability." She was right. God, she was entirely right. Leo closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The headache was fully formed now, a steel band tightening around his skull. In this life, you didn't advertise what you cared about. You hid it. You buried it deep under concrete and shell corporations. By claiming her in front of Dante, he hadn't protected her. He had painted a massive glowing target on her back. Dante couldn't touch Leo directly, but Dante would absolutely leverage a mistress to get a better deal on the South Ports. "I handled it," Leo said, opening his eyes and forcing a cold authority into his tone he didn't feel. "Dante won't touch you. He thinks you're with me. That affords you protection." Chloe let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Protection. I take the subway to work, Mr. Russo. I buy groceries at a bodega that gets robbed twice a month. I am not equipped to be mobster bait." She threw the box onto the desk. A few more receipts fluttered down. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, taking a shuddering breath. "I just wanted to pay off my student loans," she muttered into her palms. "I just wanted a quiet desk job." Leo looked at her truly. Looked at her maybe for the first time since Arthur hired her 3 months ago. She was unremarkable by the standards of the women who usually hung around the clubs. No fillers, no designer labels. Just a tired woman with ink stains on her fingertips and a terrifyingly sharp mind for numbers. But standing there, trembling with righteous anger, bathed in the ugly yellow light of a criminal's basement, she felt violently real. "You have a quiet desk job," Leo said softly. She dropped her hands and glared at him. "Not anymore." "Yes, you do." Leo took a step closer, crowding her slightly, forcing her to look up and hold his gaze. He needed her to understand the reality of the cage he had accidentally locked them both inside. "Dante talks. By tomorrow morning, half the syndicates in the city will think you share my bed. If you run, if you quit, they will think you're unprotected. They will scoop you up just to see what you know about my books." Chloe stopped breathing, the color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and fragile. She smelled like cheap vanilla soap and sheer panic. "So what do I do?" she whispered. Leo hated himself. He hated the lie he was about to solidify, but it was the only play left on the board that kept her breathing. "You do exactly what you've been doing," Leo said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "You come to work, you audit the books, but from now on Arthur drives you. You don't take the subway, you don't go to the bodega alone." He reached out his hand, hovering for a second, before he gently brushed a damp strand of hair away from her cheek. She flinched a tiny involuntary jerk, and it burned him. "And if anyone asks," Leo said, his eyes locking onto hers, the weight of the underworld pressing down on them both, "you smile and you tell them you're exactly what I said you are." Morning broke over the city like an ugly swelling bruise, washing the peeling wallpaper of Chloe's cramped studio in shades of sickly grey. She hadn't slept. The cheap percolator on her kitchenette counter sputtered, spitting bitter, burnt-smelling coffee into a chipped mug, but she ignored it. Arthur was standing in her hallway. He had been there for 20 minutes. He hadn't knocked aggressively. Just 3 sharp raps at 6 a.m., followed by the terrifying sight of his massive frame filling her peephole. Now he stood perfectly still next to her coat rack, a mountain of dark wool and silent judgment, watching her pack. "Mr. Russo prefers you bring only necessities," Arthur rumbled. His voice was a deep baritone that vibrated in the small space, making the cheap glass of her framed accounting degree rattle against the wall. "Everything else will be provided." Chloe shoved a stack of mismatched socks into the canvas duffel bag. Her hands were shaking. She hated that he could see it. "I don't need things provided, Arthur. I need my own clothes." "A security protocol," Arthur said softly. He didn't sound menacing, just immensely tired. "Your current wardrobe draws a specific kind of attention. It paints you as a civilian. Civilians are easy targets. Mr. Russo's associates expect a certain standard." Anger, hot and sour, spiked in the back of her throat. She zipped the duffel with a harsh, grating sound. She was being erased. Her boring, quiet, safe life was being packed into a bag and left behind because a man with a gold pinky ring looked at her too long, and her boss had the emotional control of a territorial pit bull. "Fine," she snapped, hoisting the strap over her shoulder. The canvas dug into her collarbone. "Let's go play dress-up." The ride to Leo's territory was suffocating. The back of the armored SUV smelled intensely of polished leather and ozone. The tinted windows turned the morning commute into a muted underwater film. Chloe sat rigidly against the door, putting as much space between herself and Arthur as physically possible. They didn't go to the club. They drove into the financial district, pulling into an underground garage that echoed with the heavy hum of ventilation shafts. Arthur led her up a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse. It was cold, not in temperature but in aesthetic. Vast expanses of slate-grey marble, sharp-edged glass furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down on the city like a god's-eye view of a chessboard. There were no pictures, no books. It didn't smell like a home. It smelled like cedarwood, cleaner, and empty space. Leo was sitting at a massive dining table, an open laptop casting a pale blue glow over his face. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose the heavy ink of tattoos wrapping his forearms, snakes and daggers bleeding into geometric patterns. He looked up when the elevator chimed. The dark circles under his eyes matched hers. "Put her bag in the guest room," Leo instructed Arthur without looking at him. His eyes locked onto Chloe. They were a flat, unreadable brown. Arthur vanished down a hallway, his heavy footsteps muffled by a thick rug. Chloe stood in the center of the living room, gripping the strap of her purse like a lifeline. "I can't live here." Leo closed the laptop. The sharp click sounded like a gavel dropping. "You can and you will. Your apartment's fire escape is a joke. Your lock can be picked with a hairpin. Until Dante finds a new distraction, you stay here. I have a cat." The lie tumbled out before she could stop it, a desperate, pathetic attempt to cling to her old reality. Leo didn't blink. "No, you don't. You have a peace lily on your windowsill that's been dead for 2 months. I read your background check." She flushed, humiliated and exposed. "You didn't have to ruin my life," she whispered, the anger draining out of her, leaving only a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. "I was just doing my job." Leo stood up. He moved with a heavy, coiled grace, crossing the distance between them until he was standing just outside her personal space. He smelled like expensive espresso and the faint, metallic tang of stress. "I know," he said. The roughness in his voice surprised her. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of guilt. It was a mistake, a stupid, visceral reaction. I owned that. But the words are out there, Chloe. Dante's lieutenant was already asking questions at the docks this morning. They want to know who you are. If you're just an accountant, they'll kidnap you to get my books. If you're my... He paused, his jaw working, as he searched for a word that didn't taste like poison. "If you are mine, they won't touch you without declaring war. And Dante isn't ready for a war." "So I'm a hostage," she clarified, her voice trembling. "You're a guest." Leo countered, his gaze dropping to her white knuckles. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His fingers brushed hers, calloused, incredibly warm, sending a jolt of static electricity up her arm. He pried her fingers loose from the purse strap. "You have free reign of the house. You can work from here. Arthur will bring the files, but you don't go out. Not until I say so." He stepped back, breaking the contact, but the ghost of his heat remained on her skin. He looked away, staring out the massive windows at the rain-slicked city. "I'll have someone bring you dinner," he said quietly. "Lock the door if it makes you feel better." Silk felt like cold water dripping down her spine. Chloe stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the guest bedroom, staring at a stranger. The dress had arrived in a matte black box 2 hours ago. It was a deep emerald green, cut dangerously low in the back, clinging to her hips in a way that made her feel painfully visible. Alongside it was a pair of black stilettos and a velvet case containing a diamond tennis bracelet that probably cost more than her college tuition. It was Friday night. The grace period of hiding in the penthouse was over. Leo had informed her they were attending a dinner at Rosa's, an upscale Italian place in Midtown that served as neutral ground for the families. "It's a visibility play," he had explained earlier, leaning against the doorframe, refusing to look at her while she was in her sweatpants. "If I keep you hidden, it looks like weakness. I need them to see you. I need them to see that I'm not afraid to parade you in front of them." She applied a layer of red lipstick, her hand steadying out of pure, stubborn spite. She wasn't going to let these monsters see her shake. When she walked out into the living room, Leo was waiting by the elevator. He wore a tailored black suit that fit him with lethal perfection, a stark contrast to the rough, tired man she had seen drinking coffee for the last 5 days. He was the boss again, the apex predator. He turned at the sound of her heels clicking on the marble. His eyes started at her face, swept down the length of the silk and back up again. The flat, unreadable wall he usually kept up fractured. For a fraction of a second, his pupils blew wide, darkening his eyes to pitch black. A muscle in his jaw jumped. "The dress is adequate." He finally managed his voice, dropping an octave sounding rougher than usual. "It's a bribe," Chloe shot back, grabbing her clutch. "Let's just get this over with." Rosa's was loud, smelling heavily of roasting garlic, expensive Barolo wine, and melting wax. The moment they stepped through the heavy oak doors, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't an immediate silence, but a subtle dampening of the noise. Eyes flicked toward them, tracking their progress across the dining room. Chloe felt a cold sweat break out at the base of her neck. Leo's hand landed on the small of her back. It was a possessive grip, his thumb resting against her bare skin, where the dress dipped low. He was radiating heat. The touch was entirely performative, designed for the watching room, but it sent a confusing, heavy flutter through her stomach. She leaned into it instinctively, seeking the only solid anchor in a room full of sharks. They were seated in a corner booth facing the room. Leo didn't sit across from her. He slid in right beside her, close enough that their thighs brushed beneath the white tablecloth. "Breathe," he murmured into her ear, leaning in close under the guise of an intimate whisper. His breath brushed her neck. "You're stiff. Relax your shoulders. You're supposed to be in love with me, remember?" "I'd rather swallow glass," she muttered back, taking a large gulp of the ice water a waiter had silently deposited. A low rumble of laughter vibrated in Leo's chest. It was a genuine sound, startling her. Fair enough. Just look bored. Arrogance reads well in this crowd. Halfway through the veal chop, a shadow fell over their table. Chloe looked up. A man in his 50s wearing a gaudy striped suit and smelling faintly of stale cigar smoke was smiling down at them. He had the kind of eyes that looked dead behind the corneas. "Leo," the man said, his voice slick. "I heard a rumor you finally acquired some decent taste. I see Dante wasn't exaggerating." Leo didn't stand up. He didn't even drop his fork. He just shifted his weight slightly, angling his body to shield Chloe from the man's direct line of sight. "Evening, Carmine. Didn't realize they let you off Staten Island on the weekends." Carmine chuckled a dry, dusty sound. He ignored Leo's insult and leaned closer to Chloe. "And who is this lovely creature you haven't introduced us to your associate?" Chloe felt Leo's hand tighten on her waist. A warning. Stay quiet. But the smell of Carmine's stale smoke reminded her of the cheap cigars her deadbeat father used to smoke. It triggered an old, stubborn defiance buried deep beneath her fear. "Chloe," she said, her voice clear and carrying over the low hum of the restaurant. Carmine raised an eyebrow. "Just Chloe. No last name. Just Chloe," she repeated, setting her wine glass down. She met his dead eyes perfectly. She remembered the ledgers Arthur had brought her yesterday. She remembered a string of shell companies registered to a C. Falcone in Staten Island, companies bleeding money through terrible logistical planning. "I'm surprised you have the time to socialize, Mr. Falcone," Chloe added, letting a touch of cool disdain enter her voice. Given the state of the harbor transit fees this quarter, the overhead on those new barges must be a nightmare to balance. The silence at the table was sudden and absolute. Carmine's slick smile vanished. The color drained from his face, replaced by a mottled, furious red. He looked at her not as a piece of meat, but as a threat. He glanced at Leo, who was staring at Chloe, with an expression she couldn't decipher, a mix of shock and something dangerously close to awe. "Enjoy your meal, Leo," Carmine spat, spinning on his heel and marching away. Leo slowly lowered his hand to his lap. He turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. "How did you know about his barges?" Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe picked up her fork, her hands perfectly steady now. The adrenaline felt incredible. "I read your books, Leo. All of them, including the regional threat assessments. Carmine is over-leveraged." She took a bite of her veal, chewing slowly. "If I have to be your target, I'm at least going to be an educated one. Streetlights cut rhythmic yellow slices across the dark interior of the armored SUV, illuminating the tense line of Leo's jaw before throwing him back into shadow. The heavy engine hummed beneath them, a low vibration that did nothing to settle the nausea swirling in Chloe's stomach. The adrenaline from Rosa's was bleeding out of her system, leaving behind a cold, sharp ache in her joints. She kept her gaze fixed on the rain sliding down the tinted glass. She didn't want to look at him. She could feel his eyes on her, a heavy physical pressure on the side of her face. It was the same way he looked at a rival's weak point on a map. "You shouldn't have done that," Leo said. His voice broke the thick silence, quiet and dangerously even. "Done what?" Chloe asked, finally turning her head. The leather seat squeaked slightly as she moved. "Use the information you pay me to analyze Carmine Falcone as a bully. Bullies understand leverage. I just reminded him he has none." "You put a spotlight on yourself," Leo shot back, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The scent of his cologne cedar and something sharp like ozone spilled into her space. "Carmine is a dinosaur, but he's a proud one. You humiliated him in front of his peers. He won't forget that. He was looking at me like I was a toy you bought to keep yourself entertained." Chloe snapped her voice, rising the fear, mutating back into anger. "I am an accountant, Leo. I have a master's degree. I am not going to sit there and let a man who can't even balance a simple logistics ledger talk down to me." Leo stared at her. The anger in his dark eyes fractured, replaced by a slow, reluctant fascination. He rubbed a hand over his mouth, the rough sound of calluses against stubble, loud in the quiet car. "You're shaking," he pointed out quietly. Chloe looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. He was right. Her fingers were trembling violently, the manicured nails she had painted that morning blurring together. She clenched them into tight fists, hiding them in the folds of the emerald silk dress. "It's a natural physiological response to a threat. I'm fine." "You're terrified." "Of course I'm terrified." She burst out the composure she had clung to all night, finally cracking. The air in the car felt suddenly too thin to breathe. "I just threatened a mafia boss." My previous stress response involved crying in a bathroom stall because I spilled coffee on a keyboard. Now I'm navigating gang warfare over veal chops. I am out of my depth. The SUV slowed, descending the concrete ramp into the underground garage of the penthouse building. The yellow streetlights were replaced by the harsh, flickering fluorescent tubes overhead. Leo didn't speak until the car lurched to a halt, and Arthur killed the engine in the front seat. The sudden silence was suffocating. "You aren't out of your depth," Leo said, unbuckling his seatbelt. He turned to face her fully in the dim light. "You read a room perfectly. You found the biggest threat at the table, and you neutralized him with 3 sentences. Most of my captains can't do that." He reached across the console. Chloe flinched, pressing her spine against the door, but he just unbuckled her seatbelt. His knuckles brushed her hip, a fleeting, burning contact. "Come upstairs," he commanded, his tone shifting back to the cold authority he wore like armor. "Take off the dress. I'll pour you a drink." The penthouse was exactly as cold and empty as they had left it. Chloe kicked off the black stilettos the second the elevator doors closed behind them, ignoring the unhygienic reality of walking barefoot on the foyer marble. Her heels were covered in blistering red marks. She didn't care. She just wanted to feel grounded. Leo shucked off his suit jacket, tossing it over the back of a glass dining chair. The movement pulled his white shirt tight across his shoulders, revealing the heavy leather shoulder holster strapped across his chest. The dark metal of the gun caught the recessed lighting. It was a jarring, violent disruption to the sterile domesticity of the room. He walked to the wet bar, the crystal decanters clinking softly, as he poured 2 generous measures of amber liquid. Chloe sank into one of the low slate-grey sofas, pulling her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. The silk dress pooled around her. She watched him, studying the rigid set of his shoulders. He was a violent man. She knew the ledgers. She knew the blood that paid for this view. Yet standing in the center of the room, handing her a glass of aged bourbon, he looked profoundly exhausted. "Drink," he ordered, pressing the cold glass into her hand. She took a sip. The liquor burned a fiery path down her throat, settling as a warm, heavy knot in her empty stomach. She coughed, squeezing her eyes shut. Leo sat on the heavy glass coffee table, directly in front of her, leaning into her space. He rested his elbows on his knees, holding his own glass loosely between his fingers. "I didn't bring you into this to make you a weapon, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "I brought you in because I needed clean books, because Arthur said you were smart, and you kept your mouth shut. I did keep my mouth shut, until you painted a target on my back," she reminded him softly. "I know." He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine regret crossing his harsh features. "And I'm dealing with it. Dante is being handled. Carmine will be handled. But what you did tonight, you can't do that again. You can't show them how smart you are." "Why?" She opened her eyes, meeting his dark, unreadable stare. "Because it emasculates you. Because your girl isn't supposed to have a brain. Because," Leo said, his voice tightening, "if they realize you understand the financial infrastructure of this city better than they do, they won't just want to leverage you against me. They will want to own you. Or they will want to put a bullet in your head." He reached out his warm, rough fingers, wrapping around her bare ankle. The touch was completely unexpected, sending a jolt of electricity straight up her leg. He didn't move his hand, just let his thumb press gently against the pulse point just below her ankle bone. "I can protect my property," Leo said the word property, tasting like ash, but necessary for the lie. "But I can't protect a threat. Be quiet, Chloe. Let me do the fighting." She stared at the hand on her ankle, then up to his face. The cynical part of her knew he was manipulating her, establishing dominance, but the terrified, exhausted part of her felt the heavy, undeniable weight of safety in his grip. "Okay," she whispered. The lie burned, going down far worse than the bourbon. Monday morning smelled like ozone and impending violence. Chloe sat cross-legged on the floor of the guest bedroom, surrounded by stacks of manila folders. The harsh morning sunlight glinted off her wire-rimmed reading glasses. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone that barely covered the sound of her highlighter scratching across balance sheets. She had spent 48 hours analyzing Dante Moretti's public-facing business holdings. Leo had told her to leave it alone. He had told her to hide. But the memory of his heavy hand on her ankle, the possessive weight of his protection, chafed against her skin like wool. She refused to be a passive pawn waiting to be traded or killed. The bedroom door opened without a knock. Leo stood in the frame. He wore dark denim and a black t-shirt that clung to the heavy muscle of his chest. His hair was damp from a shower curling slightly at the nape of his neck, but the dark circles under his eyes were bruised and purple. He looked down at the sea of paperwork covering the expensive Persian rug. "I told Arthur to keep the regional files locked down," Leo said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of the volatile heat from Friday night. That flatness scared her more than his anger. Chloe didn't look up. She meticulously capped her yellow highlighter. "Arthur is a loyal man, Leo. But he's also practical. He knows I can process data faster than your entire crew of knuckle-draggers. So when I asked him for Dante's union payrolls, he brought them. Leo stepped into the room, his boots making no sound on the rug. He stopped right at the edge of her paper fortress. He smelled faintly of mint soap and cold coffee. Dante hit one of my warehouses on the west side 3 hours ago. Leo stated his tone, conversational, as if discussing the weather. Burned it to the foundation. 2 of my night watchmen are in the ICU with 3rd-degree burns. Chloe's breath hitched. She froze the plastic cap of the highlighter digging painfully into her palm. The sterile numbers on the page suddenly felt soaked in gasoline. He sent a message. Leo continued, his dark eyes fixed on the crown of her head. He said the fire was a down payment. He wants the Southport contracts by midnight, or he starts burning things that actually matter to me. The implication hung in the air heavy and suffocating. Things that actually matter. She wasn't just a hostage anymore. She was the central piece on a burning board. Chloe slowly lifted her head. The cynic in her expected to see him pacing, shouting, preparing for a war of bullets and blood. Instead, Leo was perfectly still, watching her with a terrifying, predatory calm. "Are you going to give him the ports?" she asked, her voice raspy. "No." Leo knelt down, ignoring the crinkle of paper beneath his knee. He was so close she could see the faint, silvery scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "I'm going to rip his throat out. I'm mobilizing the crews. By tonight, Dante won't have a crew left to command." "A street war," Chloe said, the panic finally breaking through her clinical facade. "Leo, if you start a war, the feds will step in. The collateral damage is the cost of doing business." He interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He touched my territory. He threatened what is mine." "I am not yours," she shouted, scrambling backward until her spine hit the heavy wooden bed frame. The folders scattered papers sliding across the floor in a messy avalanche. "Stop saying that this isn't a movie, Leo. People are burning. You can't just shoot your way out of this because your ego is bruised." Leo's jaw locked. He leaned forward, boxing her in his hands, planting heavily on the carpet on either side of her thighs. The heat rolling off his body was intense. "My ego." He breathed the words laced with pure venom. "You think this is about ego? Dante is testing the fences. If I don't respond with overwhelming violence, every parasite in this city will think they can take a piece of me. They will think I'm soft because I let a woman live in my house. Then don't be soft." Chloe fired back, her chest heaving. She reached out, grabbing a specific blue folder from the chaos beside her leg and slamming it onto his chest. "Be smart. You don't need a street war to gut him. You just need a bank." Leo blinked, glancing down at the folder pressed against his sternum, then back up to her flushed face. "What are you talking about? Read it," she demanded, her finger tapping the thick cardboard. "Dante isn't liquid. His entire operation is propped up by high-interest loans from a shadow bank in Zurich. He uses the legitimate union dues to pay the monthly interest." Leo slowly took the folder from her hand, his eyes narrowing. He flipped it open, his gaze scanning the highlighted columns of numbers. "I know this. The Zurich accounts are ironclad. We can't touch them." "You can't touch the bank," Chloe corrected, her voice dropping into the steady, confident rhythm she used in boardrooms. "But you can touch the transit lines. Look at page 4. He routes the clean union money through 3 specific shell companies in Delaware before it wires to Zurich." She leaned forward, pointing a shaking finger at a highlighted block of text. Her shoulder brushed his chest, but neither of them pulled away. The scent of her vanilla soap tangled violently with his ozone cologne. "Those shell companies are structurally flawed," she explained, her green eyes locking onto his. "They violated the new federal compliance laws passed last quarter. They missed the filing deadline. If an anonymous tip were to go to the SEC with this exact paper trail, those accounts would be frozen by 3 p.m. today, pending investigation. Leo went perfectly still. He stared at the paper, then slowly dragged his eyes up to meet hers. The realization bloomed in his dark eyes, a terrifying mix of awe and lethal calculation. If the accounts freeze, he murmured, the violent tension in his shoulders shifting into something sharper, more focused. Dante defaults on the Zurich loan tonight. Chloe finished for him, the metallic taste of adrenaline returning. The shadow bank liquidates his assets. His own backers will break his legs by tomorrow morning. No bullets, no street war. Just math. Silence stretched between them, thick and humming with sudden electricity. The distant sound of city traffic felt miles away. Leo dropped the folder. He didn't move away. He stayed boxed around her, his face inches from hers. He reached up his thumb, roughly tracing the line of her jaw. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was entirely possessive, grounding himself in her reality. "You," Leo breathed, his voice a dark, raw vibration, "are a terrifying creature, Chloe." She swallowed hard, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, trapped in the cage of his arms. "I'm just an accountant." A slow, dark smile curved his lips, completely devoid of humor, but full of devastating promise. Not anymore. Fluorescent light from the burner laptop painted Chloe's face in an anemic, pale blue. She sat cross-legged at the massive dining table, an oversized grey wool sweater, swallowing her frame, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The penthouse was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic metallic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Leo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a heavy crystal glass of water in his hand. He wasn't drinking. He was just watching her reflection in the glass, against the backdrop of the grey afternoon skyline. Arthur was stationed by the elevator, a silent monolith of dark soot and suppressed anxiety. It was 2:45 p.m. The server nodes are routed through a VPN in Estonia. Chloe murmured, her voice scratchy from disuse. She hadn't spoken in 2 hours, entirely consumed by the labyrinth of Dante's financial architecture. "I'm attaching the PDF of the Delaware Shell Registry inconsistencies cross-referenced with the Union escrow accounts. It's entirely bureaucratic. No threats, just raw data." She swallowed hard. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. She was an auditor. She found missing commas and reconciled petty cash. She didn't ruin lives. But the lingering scent of smoke on Leo's jacket from the burned warehouse, a stark acidic smell of charred timber and melting plastic, was a physical reminder of the stakes. "Send it," Leo said. He didn't turn around. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the glass. Chloe's index finger trembled over the enter key. The plastic felt slippery under her sweat-dampened skin. If she pressed it, she was no longer a victim. She was an active participant in a syndicate war. She was pulling a trigger, just with a different kind of weapon. She closed her eyes, exhaled a shaky breath, and pressed the key. The mechanical clack echoed too loudly in the cavernous room. A small loading bar appeared on the screen, crawling from left to right. Then, a sterile green checkmark. Submission received. Chloe shoved the laptop away from her, as if it had suddenly caught fire. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs. The adrenaline that had fueled her for the last 3 hours suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow nausea. "Done," she whispered. Leo finally turned. He walked over to the table, setting his water glass down with a heavy thud. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at her. He studied the pale shade of her cheeks, the way her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. "Now we wait," he said, pulling out the chair next to her and sitting down. He was close enough that the heat radiating from his chest cut through the chill of the air conditioning. The next 45 minutes were a masterclass in psychological torture. Chloe couldn't sit still. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her bare feet sinking into the thick wool. She picked up a silver paperweight, put it down. She poured a cup of coffee that tasted like battery acid and left it untouched on the counter. Leo, conversely, was a statue. He sat in the chair, his elbows resting on the table, his dark eyes tracking her erratic movements. He didn't tell her to calm down. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just anchored the room with his sheer gravitational presence. At 3:32 p.m., Arthur's phone vibrated. The harsh, buzzing sound made Chloe physically jump. She spun around her heart, hammering wildly against her ribs. Arthur pulled the phone from his breast pocket, his massive thumb swiping across the screen. He held it to his ear, his face an unreadable mask of scarred tissue and stoicism. "Yeah," Arthur grunted into the receiver. A pause. Confirmed both accounts. Another pause. Understood. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked at Leo. "The Zurich accounts are locked," Arthur reported, his deep voice carrying a strange, unnatural reverence. The SEC triggered an automated freeze on the Delaware shells at 3:15. Dante's holding company just had its credit lines vaporized. He bounced a wire transfer to his European backers 5 minutes ago. Chloe stopped breathing. Leo slowly stood up. The leather of his chair creaked. A slow, terrifyingly dark smile spread across his face, a baring of teeth that was utterly devoid of warmth. It was the expression of a predator watching its prey bleed out in the snow. "And Dante?" Leo asked softly. "Panicking," Arthur replied. "His lieutenants are abandoning ship. Word is out that the feds are auditing the Union accounts. Nobody wants to be holding the bag. He's bleeding men by the minute." Leo turned his gaze to Chloe. The intensity in his dark eyes pinned her to the floor. It wasn't the possessive territorial glare he had used at the club, and it wasn't the protective shield he had offered at the restaurant. It was pure, unadulterated awe. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her wrists or box her in. He just stopped inches away, looking down at her, as if he had never truly seen her before. "You gutted him," Leo murmured, the rough timbre of his voice wrapping around her like heavy velvet. "Not a single shot fired, and you ripped his empire down to the studs." Chloe looked up at him, her vision blurring slightly at the edges. The reality of what she had done crashed over her, a crushing weight of moral compromise and terrifying power. "I just did the math," she whispered defensively, her voice cracking. Leo reached out. His hand, warm and rough with calluses, gently cupped the side of her neck. His thumb stroked the erratic, hammering pulse at the base of her throat. "No," he corrected, his eyes darkening to pitch black. "You did the impossible." Midnight brought a silence so profound it made her ears ring. The rain had returned, a steady driving sheet of water that battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, blurring the city lights into smeared streaks of neon. Chloe sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring blankly at the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. The bedside lamp cast a pool of warm, inadequate yellow light. Dante Moretti was dead. Arthur had delivered the news 20 minutes ago, his voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of emotion. Dante hadn't been arrested. When the shadow bank realized their collateral was frozen, they hadn't waited for the SEC to finish their investigation. They sent a collection team. Dante was found in the underground parking garage of his own building, his throat cut, his gold pinky ring missing. Chloe pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, until bursts of static color exploded in the darkness. She was trembling a deep skeletal shivering that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had killed him. She hadn't held the knife. She hadn't been in the garage. But she had drawn the map, handed over the coordinates, and locked the doors. The blood was in the ledgers, and now it was permanently stained on her hands. The sterile, clean world of numbers she had always hidden behind was gone, burned away by the reality of the violence it represented. The bedroom door opened. She didn't look up. The heavy, measured footsteps crossing the carpet could only belong to one man. The mattress dipped violently as Leo sat down beside her. He smelled of rain, expensive leather, and the sharp bite of scotch. He didn't speak immediately. He just sat there, a massive, solid wall of heat in the freezing vacuum of her panic. "Drink this," Leo instructed. He pressed a cold crystal glass into her shaking hands. She opened her eyes, staring down at the 2 fingers of dark amber liquid. She didn't argue. She raised the glass and threw it back. The scotch burned a fiery, violent path down her throat, forcing a harsh cough from her lungs. But it chased away the icy numbness gripping her chest. Leo took the empty glass from her rigid fingers and set it on the nightstand. The glass clinked loudly against the wood. "I'm an accountant," Chloe whispered to the empty room, her voice brittle, fracturing under the weight of the words. "I pay taxes. I sort receipts. I don't orchestrate executions." "You protected what was ours." Leo corrected his voice, a low, gravelly rasp. "Ours." She whipped her head around, glaring at him, the fear instantly transmuting into a desperate, defensive rage. "There is no ours, Leo. I am not part of this. I am an employee you accidentally dragged into a war zone, and now I have a dead man's blood on my conscience." He burned a building with innocent men inside Chloe. Leo snapped back, his jaw clenching, the muscles feathering along his cheek line. He was a rabid dog. If you hadn't frozen the accounts, my men would have shot up his club tonight. Collateral damage would have been in the dozens. Civilians, waitresses, valets. You saved lives today. Don't play the martyr. "I don't want to be a martyr," she yelled, shoving a hand through her tangled hair. "I want to be boring. I want to worry about my student loans, not whether a shadow bank is going to retaliate." Tears, hot and furious, finally spilled over her lower lashes, tracking burning lines down her pale cheeks. She hated crying in front of him. It felt like a surrender. She tried to turn away to hide the physical breakdown, but Leo moved faster. He reached out his large hands, gripping her shoulders, hauling her around to face him. His grip was entirely firm, a grounding weight that demanded her attention. "Look at me," he commanded. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "Chloe, look at me." It wasn't an order this time. It was a rough, desperate plea. Slowly she opened her eyes. His face was inches from hers. The harsh lines of his features were softened by a profound, agonizing vulnerability she had never seen before. The ruthless mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man staring at the only thing in his life that terrified him. "You aren't boring." Leo breathed his eyes, tracking a tear as it fell to her chin. "You never were. You walked into a room full of monsters covered in rain and clutching receipts, and you brought me to my knees without trying." He moved one hand from her shoulder, his rough thumb swiping across her damp cheek, catching the tear. The callus scraped slightly against her skin, a friction that sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to her core. "I ruined your life." Leo confessed the words, tasting like ash, rough and ugly with truth. "I dragged you into the mud because I couldn't stand the thought of another man looking at you. It was selfish. It was feral. He leaned in closer, his forehead resting against hers. His breath smelling of scotch and mint brushed her lips. "But I am not letting you go," he whispered, a dark, heavy vow vibrating between them. "You understand my world better than my own blood does. You survived it. You conquered it." Chloe's breath hitched. She should push him away. She should pack her bags, walk out into the rain, and disappear. But the intoxicating, terrifying truth was that she didn't want to. The fear was fading, replaced by a dark, heavy pull, an undeniable gravity that dragged her toward the violence toward him. She let out a fractured, shaking breath, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his dark shirt. She felt the heavy thud of his heartbeat under the cotton. "Then don't let go," she breathed. Leo groaned a rough, feral sound, drawn from the deepest part of his chest. He closed the remaining distance, his mouth crashing down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was messy, desperate, and tasted of rye whiskey and absolute inevitability. His hands tangled in her hair, holding her in place as he devoured her mouth, channeling days of terror, adrenaline, and suppressed desire into a single devastating action. Chloe kissed him back with equal ferocity, her fingernails digging into his shoulders, anchoring herself to the monster she had chosen to love. Morning tasted like old scotch and copper. Chloe peeled her eyes open. The slate-grey ceiling of the master bedroom was slowly coming into focus, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving light of a city dawn. She didn't move. Her muscles ached a deep, pulling soreness that radiated from her spine to her collarbones, the physical aftermath of adrenaline crashing out of her system. A heavy, suffocating weight rested across her waist. She turned her head an inch. Leo was asleep, his face buried in the pillow beside hers. The harsh, guarded lines of his jaw were slack. His breathing was slow, a deep, rhythmic vibration that transferred directly into her own ribs where his chest pressed against her back. One large, calloused hand was anchored firmly flat against her bare stomach beneath the tangled sheets. It wasn't a gentle embrace. Even in unconsciousness, it was a barricade, a claim. She stared at the faint silver scars weaving through the dark ink of his forearm. Yesterday she would have panicked at the absolute entrapment of it. Today she just felt a profound, exhausted stillness. She carefully slid out from under his arm. The sudden absence of his heat sent a shiver over her skin. She grabbed the oversized grey sweater off the floor, pulling it over her head as she padded barefoot out of the bedroom and down the long, silent hallway. The penthouse didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a bunker. Arthur was already in the kitchen. He was standing by the espresso machine, looking exactly the same as he had at 2 in the morning. He wore a fresh black suit, his tie perfectly straight, but the deep bags under his eyes betrayed the sleepless night. He watched her walk in, his expression completely blank. He didn't offer a polite morning greeting. He didn't ask how she slept. Instead, Arthur reached onto the black marble island and slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the counter. It stopped exactly inches from her fingertips. "The Carmine Falcone accounts." Arthur rumbled, his deep voice barely carrying over the hum of the refrigerator. "The boss requested a full vulnerability assessment by Monday, but given the shift in operations, I assumed you might want a head start." Chloe looked down at the embossed leather. It wasn't a box of messy receipts. It wasn't petty cash. It was the financial architecture of one of the 5 families. Arthur wasn't handing her homework. He was handing her a loaded weapon. She reached out her fingertips, grazing the cool leather. "He wants me to dismantle Carmine next." He wants Carmine on a leash, Arthur corrected softly. Bullets are messy. As you elegantly proved last night, debt is much cleaner. A heavy footstep sounded against the hardwood behind her. Chloe didn't turn. The scent of mint soap and sleep washed over her, a second before Leo stepped into her peripheral vision. He wore loose grey sweatpants, his chest bare, the tattoos fully exposed to the morning light. He looked rough, his dark hair sticking up at awkward angles, a shadow of heavy stubble darkening his jaw. He walked directly to the island, stopping right beside her. He didn't look at Arthur. He reached out his knuckles, brushing her wrist in a fleeting, possessive drag of skin against skin, before he picked up a ceramic mug. "Did you sleep?" Leo asked, his voice thick and gravelly with sleep. "No," Chloe answered honestly. She turned her head to look at him. In the stark daylight, the reality of what they had done, what she had done, felt inescapable. She searched his dark eyes for a flicker of regret, a sign that the feral desperation of the previous night had faded into a cold morning-after mistake. There was nothing but absolute terrifying certainty. Leo set the mug down. He turned his body entirely toward her, boxing her in against the counter, just as he had done on the floor of the guest room. But this time she didn't shrink back. She held her ground, letting the physical proximity burn between them. "Dante's territory is fractured," Leo stated, his tone shifting into the cold, clinical rhythm of business. "My captains are moving in to absorb the southern docks. There will be meetings, sit-downs. The other families are going to want to know how a shadow bank gutted a syndicate in 3 hours without a single gunshot." "What are you going to tell them?" she asked, her voice quiet. Leo reached up his thumb, tracing the faint, bruised shadow under her eye. "I'm going to tell them the truth. I'm going to tell them my accountant found a rounding error." A short, breathless laugh escaped her lips, sounding brittle in the quiet kitchen. "They'll be terrified." "Good." He leaned in his lips, brushing against her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "Let them look. Let them ask questions. But when they see you, they're going to know exactly whose ledger you balance." Chloe closed her eyes, leaning into the rough texture of his jaw. The lingering guilt over Dante Moretti was still there, a dark stain on her conscience that would never completely wash out. But as Leo's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, the fear dissolved entirely. She opened her eyes, looking past his shoulder, at the heavy leather-bound portfolio resting on the marble counter. It was a terrifying world. It was violent, deeply flawed, and built on blood, but it was hers too. "Tell Arthur to bring me the Staten Island zoning permits," Chloe murmured, her hands coming up to rest flat against the heavy muscle of his chest. "If we're putting a leash on Carmine, I need to know exactly how much his throat can take before it snaps." Leo froze. A low, dark rumble of laughter vibrated deep in his chest. He pulled back just enough to look down at her, a predatory, devastating smile breaking across his harsh features. He had claimed her out of reflex. He had kept her out of instinct. But looking at the cold, beautiful calculation in her green eyes, he realized the terrifying truth. He didn't own her. They owned the city.